Welcome back to Read by Angelique. I am Angelique, and today we are continuing on our reading of The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. In the last video, I read chapters 19 and 20, so let me give you a quick recap before we keep going on into chapter 21. So, if you remember, the police officer, the investigative officer who's trying to figure out what happened to Christine sent Raoul on a wild goose chase. At first to go chase his brother, whom he suggested was the person that kidnapped Christine. But the investigator really didn't believe that. He's just trying to get Raoul out because he was talking about the ghost and sounded pretty crazy. On his way out of the opera house to go pursue his brother, Raoul runs into the Persian. And we've met him before, briefly. He is the one that kind of warned Raoul about the ghost earlier in the book. So he runs into this Persian. It's like, I've seen you before. Like, kind of, it's like, what are you doing here? What's your role? You knew something about the ghost. How do you know stuff? And in this interaction, the Persian convinces Raoul that Christine is not with his brother. He is actually with Erik in the opera house. And based off of how convincing the Persian is speaking, he talks about the Erik as a monster, but he has the same sort of affection in his voice like Christine had when she talked about the ghost. So Raoul is like, this guy really knows him. He might know his stuff. And he kind of throws his lot in with the Persian. It's like, take me to her. Can you take me? So the Persian is like, yes, let me take you. They start going through secret corridors and they're like in between walls and different things. They sneak their way into Christine's dressing room. And this is the exact place where Raoul was just like moments ago. When they get to the dressing room, they run into another man who is the butler of the Persian. And he delivers 2 revolvers. So the Persian gives Raoul 1 revolver and he carries one. And he says, hold this pistol like you are going to shoot it at all times. Hold it at the level of your eye. And then the butler leaves, and Raoul's like, this guy's got to trust me if he's gonna trust me with a revolver, right? Like, he must be like, okay. And then Raoul starts talking about how he's been in the dressing room before and how he saw Christine vanish through the mirror. And the Persian's like, yes, I know. It has locks and mechanisms. If you push it a certain way and you wait, it has a counterbalance and it'll open. So the Persian's working, trying to open the mirror, and it takes kind of forever. It gets a little stuck, but finally they make it through, and Raoul's like, oh my goodness, that's how he does it. Like, who in the world built all of these interesting like passages and trap doors into the opera house? And the Persian is like, Erik built it, of course. And that kind of like breaks Raoul's brain because he's like, how old is he? Like, could he really have done that? Is he that smart? All this different stuff. And so they make their way behind the scenes, and you're kind of tracking their movements the whole time because they can hear and even see people through walls and different things as they're making their way around. They get to the place where they call it the organ, but it's actually where the lights are controlled. So they have mostly gas lights in the opera house, though some of it is electric, but not all of it. So the lights went out for Christine to disappear using the gas lights. So the investigative officer is there with some people kind of figuring out what happened there. And they find 3 bodies. The gas organ manager and his 2 apprentices. At first, Raoul and the Persian stumble across the bodies and they're like, oh my goodness, Erik killed these people. But they kind of backed up into the shadows. the officer looked at them and they weren't dead. They were just passed out. And there was something about them taking snuff, and the officer was like, there was like this snuff box, and the officer takes it and he's like, oh, that's my snuff, and sticks it in his pocket. I just thought that was interesting. Anyway, they leave, and the Persian and Raoul continue their journey, making their way down to find the ghost. They're trying to get to his house, which is on the other side of the lake, but they can't cross the lake. The Persian says anyone that's ever tried to cross the lake has not made it, so we have to find a different way around. So they're going, and then, and it's almost in pitch black. Every once in a while we'll see glowing things, but they like aren't using light to stay hidden, and they're being extra quiet. And the Persian keeps telling Raoul, keep your gun up at the level of your eye. And eventually he says, you actually don't need the gun. We don't need a gun, but you need to keep your hand as if you were shooting here. And I think, I don't want to spoil anything. I think it'll share why he's doing that later, maybe in more detail. But they're kind of, the Persian is paranoid, where it's like, keep your hand up, keep your hand up. At one point, they're even crawling on their hands and knees, but they only use one hand to make sure that one hand stays up. And then they get to the place where, in like one of the first chapters, I think it's chapter 1 or chapter 2, they had found a body hung. One of the scene changers had hung himself there behind a prop. So they go behind this prop where he once was, and there's a secret door that they go behind. And when they go behind this, there's this red rope on the ground, like a lynch. And the Persian is so disgusted, he grabs it and he kind of throws it away. And he's like, that must have been the rope that hung the guy right over there. And they couldn't find it because it was behind this trap door. And then they also have to go down a few, they get to this, so there's a reservoir inside the opera house. And in real life, the opera house, this is like after, like it actually has like a little lake in it. They had to do it because they had to build this because of drainage. So Gaston Leroux uses that element and kind of just makes this fantasy world out of it, but also practical things that actually exist. So how it works is like the place that's holding all this water, the reservoir, it's like double walled so that the water doesn't seep out and it stays contained, and that doesn't get nicked and all different things, whatever technically how they use that. And so they are having to like climb through those and get through the different walls and stuff around the water. And eventually, there was this other part, they kind of get lost because this glowing like fire head starts following them, and they freak out. And the guy that was hung, he talked about the fire head, but no one believed him. And then all of a sudden the Persian's like, I didn't believe him, but look, it exists. It's really here in these catacomby type places. I mean, it's not an actual catacomb because it's not like a grave. But so they start running, but this head keeps following them and starts gaining on them. And they hear this scratching noise. They're like, it describes it as being like thousands and thousands of needles scratching on a chalkboard. When I read that, I just like cringed. I was like, I could feel it. And but it keeps getting louder and it keeps gaining on them until eventually it's on them, like right up, it's caught up to them. And they stop and they look back, and the scratching thing starts climbing up their legs. But when they look, it's actually, it's a ratter, like a guy that catches rats down there in all the tunnels. And he's holding this fire light that kind of like attracts the rats and they go where it goes. But when it glows on his face, it just looks like this hideous fire face. And the rat guy kind of talks to them a little bit, But then, like, I don't know why he chased them. It was kind of ridiculous. Because then he just, like, turns his light and all of the rats chase the light and him a different direction. And so the Persian and Raoul are just there like, what just happened? And they have to re-find their way back to where they're going because they got kind of lost. But when we ended, they had just found the lasso, and they're in a sort of like, they call it the torture chamber. The Persian says that he had experience in this place. And so the next chapter is talking about the Persian's experience in this place with the Phantom of the Opera. So, Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, chapter 21. This word's really hard. Okay. Vicissitudes of a Persian. The Persian's narrative. It was the first time that I had entered the house on the lake. I had often begged the trapdoor lover, as we used to call Erik in my country, to open its mysterious doors to me. He always refused. I made many attempts, but in vain, to obtain admittance. Watch him as I might, after I first learnt he had taken up his permanent abode at the opera, the darkness was always too thick to enable me to see how he worked the door in the wall on the lake. One day, when I thought myself alone, I stepped into the boat and rowed towards that part of the wall through which I had seen Erik disappear. It was then that I came into contact with a siren who guarded the approach of whose charm was very nearly fatal to me. I had no sooner put off from the bank than the silence amid which I floated on the water was disturbed by a sort of whispered singing that hovered all around me. It was half breath, half music. It rose softly from the waters of the lake, and I was surrounded by it through I knew not what artifice. It followed me, moved with me, and was so soft that it did not alarm me. On the contrary, in my longing to approach the source of that sweet and enticing harmony, I leant out of my little boat over the water, for there was no doubt in my mind that the singing came from the water itself. By this time I was alone in the boat in the middle of the lake. The voice, for it was now distinctly a voice, was beside me on the water. I leant still further. The lake was perfectly calm, and a moonbeam that passed through the air hole in the Rue Scribe showed me absolutely nothing on the surface, which was smooth and black as ink. I shook my head to get rid of a possible humming in the ears, but I soon had to accept the fact that no humming in the ears could equal in harmony the singing whisper that followed and now attracted me. Had I inclined to superstition, I should certainly have thought that I had to do with some siren whose business it was to confound the traveler rash enough to venture on the waters of the house on the lake. Fortunately, I come from a country where we are too fond of fantastic things not to know them through and through, and I had no doubt but that I was face to face with some new invention of Erik's. But this invention was so perfect that, as I leant out of the boat, I was impelled less by a desire to discover its trick than to enjoy its charm, and I leant out, until I almost overturned the boat. Suddenly, two monstrous arms issued from the bosom of the waters and seized me by the neck, dragging me down to the depths of its irresistible force. I should certainly have been lost, if I had not had time to give a cry by which Erik knew me. For it was he, and, instead of drowning me, as was certainly his first intention, he swam with me and laid me gently on the bank. "How imprudent you are," he said, as he stood before me, dripping with water. Why try to enter my house? I did not invite you. I don't want you there, nor anybody. Did you save my life only to make it unbearable to me? However great the service rendered, Erik will perhaps end by forgetting it. And you know that nothing can restrain Erik, not even Erik himself." He spoke, but I had now no other wish than to know what I already called the trick of the siren. He satisfied my curiosity, for Erik, who was a real monster, I have seen him at work in Persia, alas, is also in certain respects a regular child, vain and self-conceited, and there is nothing he loves so much as, after astonishing people, to prove the really miraculous ingenuity of his mind. He laughed and showed me a long reed. "It's the silliest trick you ever saw," he said, "but it's very useful for breathing and singing in the water. I learned it from the Tonkin pirates, who are able to lie hidden for hours at a time in the bed of the rivers." I spoke to him severely. "It's a trick that nearly killed me," I said, "and it may have been fatal to others. You know what you promised me, Erik. No more murders." "Have I really committed murders?" he asked, putting on his most amiable air. "Wretched man," I cried, "have you forgotten the rosy hours of Mazindaran?" "Yes," he replied in a sadder tone. "I prefer to forget them. I used to make the little sultana laugh, though." "All that belongs to the past," I declared. "But there is the present, and you are responsible to me for the present, because if I had wished, there would have been if I had wished, there would have been none at all for you. Remember that, Erik? I saved your life." And I took advantage of the turn in the conversation to speak to him of something that had long been on my mind. "Erik," I said. "Erik, swear that—" "Swear what?" he retorted. "You know I never keep my oaths. Oaths are made to catch fools with." "Tell me. You can tell me, at any rate." Well, the chandelier." "The chandelier, Erik." "What about the chandelier?" "You know what I mean." "Oh," he sniggered. "I don't mind telling you about the chandelier. It wasn't I. The chandelier was very old and worn." When Erik laughed, he was more terrible than ever. He jumped into the boat, chuckling so horribly that I could not help trembling. "Very old and worn, my dear Daroga. Very old and worn, the chandelier. It fell of itself. It came down with a smash. And now, Daroga, take my advice and go and dry yourself, or you'll catch a cold in the head. And never get into my boat again. And, whatever you do, don't try to enter my house. I am not always at home, Daroga, and I should be sorry to have to dedicate my requiem mass to you." So saying, swaying to and fro like a monkey, and still chuckling, he pushed off and soon disappeared in the darkness of the lake. From that day, I gave up all thought of penetrating into his house by way of the lake. That entrance was obviously too well guarded, especially since he had learnt that I knew about it. But I felt that there must be another entrance, for I had often seen Erik disappear in the third cellar while I was watching him, though I could not imagine how. Ever since I discovered Erik installed in the opera, I had lived in a perpetual terror of his horrible fancies, not in so far as I was concerned, but I dreaded everything for others. And whenever some accident, some fatal event happened, I always thought to myself, I should not be surprised if that were Erik. Even as others used to say, "It's the ghost." How often have I not heard people utter that phrase with a smile? Poor devils! If they had known that the ghost existed in the flesh, I swear they would not have laughed. Although Erik announced to me very solemnly that he had altered and that he had become the most virtuous of men since he was loved for himself, a sentence that at first perplexed me most terribly. I could not help shuddering when I thought of the monster. His horrible, unparalleled, and repulsive ugliness put him without the pale of humanity, and it often seemed to me that, for this reason, he had ceased to believe that he had any duty towards the human race. The way in which he spoke of his love affairs only increased my alarm, for I foresaw the cause of fresh and more hideous tragedies in this event to which he alluded so boastfully. On the other hand, I soon discovered the curious moral traffic established between the monster and Christine Daae. Hidden in the lumber room next to the young prima donna's dressing room, I listened to wonderful music displays that evidently flung Christine into a marvelous ecstasy. But, all the same, I would never have thought that Erik's voice, which was loud as thunder or soft as angels' voices at will, could have made her forget his ugliness. I understood all when I learnt that Christine had not yet seen him. I had occasion to go to the dressing room, and remembering the lessons he had once given me, I had no difficulty in discovering the trick that made the wall with the mirror swing round, and I ascertained the means, of hollow bricks and so on, by which he made his voice carry to Christine as though she heard it close beside her. In this way also I discovered that the road that led to the well and the dungeon, the communist dungeon, and also the trap door that enabled Erik to go straight to the cellars below the stage. A few days later, what was not my amazement to learn by my own eyes and ears that Erik and Christine Daae saw each other, and to catch the monster stooping over the little well in the communist road and sprinkling the forehead of Christine Daae, who had fainted. A white horse, the white horse out of the Prophet, which had disappeared from the stables under the opera, was standing quietly beside them. I showed myself. It was terrible. I saw sparks fly from those yellow eyes, and before I had time to say a word, I received a blow on the head that stunned me. When I came to myself again, Erik, Christine, and the white horse had disappeared. I felt sure that the poor girl was a prisoner in the house on the lake. Without hesitation, I resolved to return to the shore, notwithstanding the certain danger. For 24 hours I lay watching for the monster to appear, for I felt that he must go out, driven by the need of obtaining provisions. And in this connection I may say that, when he went out in the streets or ventured to show himself in public, he wore a pasteboard nose with a mustache attached to it, instead of his own horrible hole of a nose. This did not quite take away his corpse-like aspect, but it made him almost, I say almost, endurable to look at. I therefore watched on the bank of the lake, and weary of long waiting, was beginning to think that he had gone through the other door in the third cellar, when I heard a slight splash in the dark. I saw the two yellow eyes shining like candles, and soon the boat touched shore. Erik jumped out and walked up to me. "You've been here for 24 hours, he said, "and you're annoying me. I tell you, all this will end very badly, and you will have brought it upon yourself, for I have been extraordinarily patient with you. You think you are following me, you silly ass, whereas it's I who am following you. And I know all that you know about me. Here, I spared you yesterday in my communist road, but I warn you, seriously, don't let me catch you there again. Upon my word, you don't seem able to take a hint." He was so furious that I did not think, for the moment, of interrupting him. After puffing and blowing like a walrus, he put his horrible thought into words. "Yes, you must learn once and for all. Once and for all, I say, to take a hint. I tell you that, with your recklessness, for you have already been twice arrested by the shade in the felt hat. You did not know what you were doing in the cellars, and took you to the managers, who looked upon you as an eccentric Persian interested in stage mechanisms and life behind the scenes. I know all about it. I was there, in the office. You know I am everywhere. Well, I tell you that, with your recklessness, they will begin to wonder what you are after here. and they will end by knowing that you are after Erik, and they will be after Erik themselves, and they will discover the house on the lake. If they do, it will be a bad lookout for you, old chap. A bad lookout. I won't answer for anything." Again he puffed and blew like a walrus. "I won't answer for anything. If Erik's secrets cease to be Erik's secrets, it will be a bad lookout for a large number of the human race. That's all I had to tell you, and unless you are a sillier ass than I thought, it ought to be enough for you, except that you don't know how to take a hint." He sat down on the stern of his boat and kicked his heels against the planks, waiting to hear what I had to answer. I simply said, "It's not Erik that I'm after here." "Who, then?" "You know as well as I do. It's Christine Daae." He retorted, "I have every right to see her in my house. I am loved for my own sake." "That's not true," I said. "You have carried her off and are keeping her locked up." "Listen," he said. "Will you promise never to meddle with my affairs if I prove to you that I am loved for my own sake?" "Yes, I promise you," I replied without hesitation, for I felt convinced that for such a monster the proof was impossible. "Well, then, it's quite simple. Christine Daae shall leave this as she pleases and come back again. Yes, come back again, because she wishes. Come back of herself, because she loves me for myself. Oh, I doubt if she will come back, but it is your duty to let her go." "My duty, you silly ass." "It is my wish to her go." And that's just weirdly worded. "My wish to her go, and she will come back again, for she loves me. All this will end in a marriage at the Madeleine, you silly ass. Do you believe me now, when I tell you that my nuptial mass is written? Wait till you hear the Kyrie." He beat time with his heels on the planks of the boat and sang, "Kyrie, Kyrie, Kyrie eleison. Wait till you hear that mass." "Look here," I said, "I shall believe you if I see Christine Daae come out of the house on the lake and go back to it of her own accord." "And you won't meddle any more in my affairs?" "No." "Very well, you shall see that tonight. Come to the masked ball. Christine and I will go and have a look around. Then you can hide in the lumber room, and you shall see Christine, who will have gone to her dressing room, delighted to come back by the communist road. And now, be off, for I must go and do some shopping." To my intense astonishment, things happened as he had said. Christine Daae left the house on the lake and returned to it several times without apparently being forced to do so. I then tried to cease thinking about this mysterious love affair, but it was very difficult for me to put Erik out of my mind entirely. However, I resolved to be extremely prudent and did not make the mistake of returning to the shore of the lake or of going by the communist road. But the idea of the secret entrance in the third cellar haunted me, and I repeatedly went and waited for hours behind a scene from the Roi de l'Or, which had been left there for some reason or other. It was an opera which was not often given. At last my patience was rewarded. One day I saw the monster come towards me on his knees. I was certain that he could not see me. He passed between the scene behind which I stood and a set-piece, went to the wall and pressed on a spring that moved a stone and afforded him an ingress. He passed through this, and the stone closed behind him. I waited for at least 30 minutes and then pressed the spring in my turn. Everything happened as with Erik, but I was careful not to go through the hole myself, for I knew that Erik was inside. On the other hand, the idea that I might be caught by Erik suddenly made me think of the death of Joseph Baquet. I did not wish to jeopardize the advantages of so great a discovery, which might be useful to many people, to a large number of the human race, in Erik's words, and I left the cellars of the opera after carefully replacing the stone. I continued to be greatly interested in the relations between Erik and Christine Daae, not from any morbid curiosity, but because of the terrible thought which obsessed my mind that Erik was capable of anything if he once discovered that he was not loved for his own sake, as he imagined. I continued to wander very cautiously about the opera, and soon learned the truth about the monster's dreary love affair. He filled Christine's mind through the terror with which he inspired her, but the dear child's heart belonged wholly to the Viscount Raoul de Chagny. While they played about like an innocent engaged couple, keeping to the upper floors of the opera to avoid the monster, they little suspected that someone was watching over their safety. I was prepared to go to all lengths to kill the monster, if necessary, and explain to the police afterwards. But Erik did not show himself, and I felt none the more comfortable for that. I must state my whole plan. I thought that the monster, being driven from his home by jealousy, would thus enable me to enter it without danger through the passage in the third cellar. It was important, for everybody's sake, that I should know exactly what was inside. One day, tired of waiting for an opportunity, I moved the stone and at once heard an astounding music. The monster was working at his Don Juan triumphant, with every door in his house wide open. I knew that this was the work of his life. I was careful not to stir, and remained prudently in my dark hole. He stopped playing for a moment, and began walking about his place like a madman, and he said aloud at the top of his voice, "It must be finished first, quite finished." This speech was not calculated to reassure me, and when the music recommenced, I closed the stone very softly. On the day of the abduction of Christine Daae, I did not come to the theatre until rather late in the evening, trembling lest I should hear bad news. I had spent a horrible day, for after reading in a morning paper the announcement of a forthcoming marriage between Christine and the Viscount de Chagny, I wondered whether, after all, I should not do better to denounce the monster. But my common sense returned to me and soon showed me that any such action could only precipitate the possible catastrophe. When my cab put me down before the opera, I was really almost astonished to see it still standing. But I am something of a fatalist, like all good Orientals, and I entered ready for anything. Christine Daae's abduction in the prison act, which naturally surprised everybody, found me prepared. It was quite certain that she had been juggled away by Erik, that prince of conjurers, and I thought positively that this was the end of Christine and perhaps of everybody, so much so that I thought of advising all those people who were staying on at the theatre to make good their escape. I felt, however, that they would be sure to look upon me as mad, and I refrained. On the other hand, I resolved personally to act without further delay. The chances were in my favor that Erik at that moment was thinking only of his captive. This was the moment to enter his house through the third cellar, and I resolved to take with me that poor little desperate Viscount, who, at the first suggestion, accepted with an amount of confidence in myself that touched me profoundly. I had sent my servant for my pistols. I gave one to the Viscount, and advised him to hold himself ready to fire, for after all, Erik might be waiting for us behind the wall. We were to go by the communist road, and through the trap door. Seeing my pistols, the little Viscount asked me if we were going to fight a duel. I said, "Yes, and what a duel!" But, of course, I had no time to explain things to him. The Viscount is a brave little fellow, but he knew hardly anything about his adversary, and that was all the better. My great fear was lest he were already somewhere near us, preparing the Punjab lasso. No one knows better than he how to throw the Punjab lasso, for he is the king of stranglers, even as he is the prince of conjurers. When he had finished making the little sultana laugh, at the time of the rosy hours of Mazenderan, She herself used to ask him to amuse her by giving her a thrill. It was then that he introduced the sport of the Punjab lasso. He had lived in India and acquired an incredible skill in the art of strangulation. He would make them lock him into a courtyard to which they brought a warrior, usually a man condemned to death, armed with a long pike and a big sword. Erik had only his lasso, and it was always just when the warrior thought that he was going to fell Erik with a tremendous blow that he heard the lasso whiz through the air. With a turn of the wrist, Erik tightened the noose round his adversary's neck and, in this fashion, dragged him before the little sultana and her woman, who sat looking from a window and applauding. The little sultana herself learnt to wield the Punjab lasso and killed several of her women and even the ladies who came to call. But I prefer to drop this terrible subject of the rosy hours of Mazandaran. I have mentioned it only to explain why, on arriving with the Viscount de Cheny in the cellars of the opera, I felt bound to protect my companion against the ever-threatening danger of death by strangling. My pistols could serve no purpose, for Erik was not likely to show himself, but Erik could always strangle us. I had no time to explain all this to the Viscount. Besides, there was nothing to be gained by complicating the position. I simply told Monsieur de Cheny to keep his hand at the level of his eyes, with the arm bent as though waiting for the command to fire. With his victim in this attitude, it is impossible, even to the most expert strangler, to throw the lasso with advantage. It catches you not only around the neck, but also around the arm or hand. This enables you easily to unloose the lasso, which then becomes harmless. After avoiding the commissary of police, a number of door shutters, and the firemen, after meeting the rat-catcher and passing the man in the felt hat unperceived, the Viscount and I arrived without obstacle in the third cellar. Between the set-piece and the scene from the Roi de Lahore, I worked the stone, and we jumped into the house which Erik had built himself in the double case of the foundation walls of the opera. And this was the easiest thing in the world for him to do, because Erik was one of the chief contractors under Philip Garnier, the architect of the opera, and continued to work mysteriously all by himself when the works were officially suspended during the war, the siege of Paris, and the Commune. I knew my Erik too well to feel at all comfortable when I jumped into his house. I knew what he had made of a certain palace at Mazandaran. From being the most honest building conceivable, he soon turned it into a house of the very devil, where you could not utter a word but it was overheard or repeated by an echo. With his trap doors, the monster was responsible for endless tragedies of all kinds, his hint upon astonishing inventions. Of these, the most curious, horrible, and dangerous was the so-called torture chamber. Except in special cases, when the little sultana amused herself by inflicting suffering upon some unoffending citizen, no one was let into it but wretches condemned to death. And even then, when these had had enough, they were always at liberty to put an end to themselves with a Punjab lasso or bowstring left to their use at the foot of an iron tree. My alarm, therefore, was great when I saw that the room into which Monsieur le Vicomte de Cheny and I had dropped was an exact copy of the torture chamber of the rosy hours of Mazandaran. At our feet, I found the Punjab lasso which I had been dreading all evening. I was convinced that this rope had already done duty for Joseph Baquet, who, like myself, must have caught Erik one evening working the stone in the third cellar. He probably tried it in his turn, fell into the torture chamber, and only left it hanged. I could well imagine Erik dragging the body, in order to get rid of it, to the scene from the Roi de Lahore, and hanging it there as an example, or to increase the superstitious terror that was to help him in guarding the approaches to his lair. Then, upon reflection, Erik went back to fetch the Punjab lasso, which is very curiously made out of catgut, and which might have set an examining magistrate thinking. This explains the disappearance of the rope. And now I discovered the lasso, at our feet in the torture chamber. I am no coward, but cold sweat covered my forehead as I moved the little red disc of my lantern over the walls. Monsieur de Chaney noticed it and asked, "What is the matter, sir?" I made him a violent sign to be silent. End of chapter 21. Well, that was interesting. Man, the ghost is so dark. I just remember, like, the movie, it's a villain that you feel compassion for, you know? But the book doesn't do that so much. He is a serial killer, basically. Yikes. Anyway, we're so close to being done. You can't see that. So close to being done. I'm excited. The next chapter is called In the Torture Chamber. So just wait in anticipation for that. And it's also in the Persian's narrative, which I really enjoyed because there's been an overarching narrator. I can't remember who it is narrating the book. It's someone that's like post opera house, whatever. So I love it coming from the Persian's perspective. I think that's fun. Anyway, cheers until next time.